Welcome back, guys. Support me by clicking the subscribe button and getting me to 1,000 subscribers. Thank you so much. On the second night of the 2025 NFL Draft, while Shedeur Sanders sat in a room in Green Bay waiting for a call that wasn't coming, his phone rang. The caller said he was Mickey Loomis, general manager of the New Orleans Saints. He told Sanders he was about to be drafted. Sanders, who had been live streaming the entire weekend, answered on camera. You can watch the moment his face changes as he tries to process what he's hearing. Then the caller said he was sorry, that Sanders would have to wait a little longer. It was a prank. The caller was Jax Ulbrich, the 21-year-old son of Atlanta Falcons defensive coordinator Jeff Ulbrich, who had found Sanders' private number on his father's unlocked iPad. The NFL later fined the Falcons $250,000 and Jeff Ulbrich personally $100,000 for failing to protect confidential information distributed ahead of the draft. That prank call is the detail every outlet ran because it was humiliating and human and impossible to look away from. But it is also the least interesting thing that happened to Shedeur Sanders that weekend. What happened before the phone rang is what this video is about. Here is the number you need to hold in your head: 144. That was the pick the Cleveland Browns used on April 26, 2025, to select Shedeur Sanders in the 5th round. 5 quarterbacks were taken before him. He was not the first quarterback taken by the Browns. That distinction went to Dillon Gabriel, selected with the 94th pick in the 3rd round. Sanders was the 144th player selected overall, and the 6th quarterback off the board, behind Cam Ward, Jackson Dart, Tyler Shaw, Jalen Milroe, and Gabriel. Now here's the second member, 27. That is where the Ringer had Sanders ranked on their pre-draft big board. Daniel Jeremiah of NFL Network, a man with sources across every front office in the league, had him 20th overall. Yahoo Sports had him 41st. The consensus across the analytical draft community placed him somewhere between a late first round and an early second round selection. No major evaluation system had him below the top 50. You cannot explain the distance between those two numbers, 27 and 144, with football. The football did not change between February and April. His tape did not degrade. His arm did not get weaker. The 74% completion rate he posted in 2024, leading every quarterback in the Football Bowl subdivision, did not disappear from the record. The 4,134 passing yards, the 37 touchdowns against 10 interceptions across 13 starts, the Johnny Unitas Golden Arm Award given to the best senior quarterback in college football. PFF graded him at 90.9 in 2024, 3rd best among all draft-eligible passers. None of that changed. What changed was the NFL's reading of who Shedeur Sanders was as a person, and more precisely, what allowing him to succeed on his own terms would cost the institution. That reading produced a coordinated outcome, an understanding how 31 franchises arrived at the same conclusion, all at the same moment, without any formal agreement or visible coordination, tells you something specific about how the NFL actually protects itself. There is a sentence that circulates privately among NFL scouts and executives, and it surfaces occasionally in on-record comments before quickly being walked back. The sentence is this: we want them poor, hungry, and desperate, so they'll do whatever they're told to do. That sentence appeared in the reporting around the 2026 draft, attributed to an anonymous source who was explaining why Shedeur Sanders' draft slide still casts a shadow over every prospect who came after him. The source did not mean it as a confession. They meant it as an honest description of how the draft has always worked and why the players who enter it are not supposed to have alternatives. Shedeur Sanders had alternatives. He had been making money from name, image, and likeness deals since 2021, when the NCAA finally allowed college athletes to profit from their own identities. By the time he entered the 2025 draft, he had signed deals with Nike, Gatorade, and other brands. His father, Deion Sanders, had just signed a $54 million contract extension to continue coaching at Colorado. Shedeur showed up to his draft party with Louis Vuitton bags. He wore a $350,000 watch on game days at Colorado and had been known to show it to opposing players during trash talk. None of those things are disqualifying in any profession except the one he was trying to enter. The NFL draft operates on a premise so old no one questions it anymore. The team picks the player, not the other way around. That premise is the foundation of the entire economic structure. Rookie contracts are slotted by draft position. A first-round pick earns a guaranteed contract worth tens of millions. A fifth-round pick signs for the league minimum. The lower a team drafts a player, the less leverage that player has before he ever takes a snap. The draft is, among other things, a wage-setting mechanism, and it requires every participant to accept the premise that the market for their labor is whatever pick number the teams assign them. Shedeur Sanders, through his father, had made clear he did not fully accept that premise. In March 2024, on the $1 Million Worth of Game podcast, Deion Sanders said he knew where he wanted his sons to go and that certain cities were not going to happen. It's going to be an Eli, he said, referring to the 2004 draft situation in which Eli Manning, backed by his father Archie, refused to play for the San Diego Chargers and was traded to the New York Giants on draft day. The comparison was imprecise in a way that would prove costly. Eli Manning was considered a generational prospect, the clear first overall pick, and his father Archie conducted the negotiation quietly and through back channels. Deion Sanders made his comments on a public podcast and then repeated versions of them for the next 12 months. The deeper problem with the Eli comparison is not that Deion made it publicly. The deeper problem is that it was only half of the historical record. The two times a player successfully exerted his will on the draft, in 1983 when John Elway threatened to play baseball rather than suit up for the Baltimore Colts, and in 2004 when Manning refused the Chargers. Both players were viewed by the league as once-in-a-generation talents, whose absence from a franchise would cause measurable damage to the product. The institution bent for them because it could not afford not to. Shedeur Sanders was not that. He was a very good prospect in a weak quarterback class, with a legitimate case for the late first round, operating with the same posture that only works when the institution needs you more than you need it. Deion Sanders had spent a decade as one of the most charismatic and commercially valuable players in NFL history. He understood leverage in football better than almost anyone alive, and he read this situation wrong, not because the leverage wasn't real, but because NIL money and a famous father are not the same thing as being the one player 32 franchises cannot afford to lose. The institutional response was not loud. It did not need to be. Teams simply started to find reasons. An anonymous NFL quarterback coach told reporter Josina Anderson at the Combine in February 2025 that Sanders came across as brash and arrogant. NFL draft analyst Todd McShay reported that some teams felt Sanders did not bring a professional approach to his interviews. NFL Network's Tom Pelissero reported that one longtime NFL assistant coach called Sanders' formal interview the worst formal interview I've ever been in my life, and described him as entitled. CBS Sports insider Jonathan Jones reported that Sanders had more or less sandbagged his meetings with teams he didn't want to draft him, deliberately underperforming in interviews to reduce the chance of landing somewhere unappealing. The Giants, who many expected to take Sanders after trading into the first round at pick 25, instead selected Ole Miss quarterback Jackson Dart. Reports indicated they had been interested in Sanders, but were put off during the interview process. Every one of those reports came from anonymous sources. Not one scout, coach, or executive put their name on a criticism of Shedeur Sanders' character during the pre-draft process. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because the NFL draft pre-draft circuit in which teams conduct formal interviews with prospects at the Combine in Indianapolis every February, is supposed to be a talent evaluation process. Scouts watch tape, coaches discuss schemes, teams make informed decisions about who can play and who cannot. Anonymous character attacks from unnamed coaches do not normally function as draft currency. They became draft currency for Shedeur Sanders because there was a shared institutional need for them to. Here is what the on field evaluation actually said. PFF's pre draft scouting report noted that Sanders finished 2024 with the third highest accuracy rate among all FBS quarterbacks and the fifth lowest rate of uncatchable throws in the country. He handled more dropbacks under pressure than any other quarterback in the Football Bowl subdivision, more than the second most pressured quarterback by nearly 20 dropbacks, and he maintained a turnover-worthy play percentage of 1.3%, third best among all draft-eligible quarterbacks. ESPN's Mel Kiper, Matt Miller, and multiple scout-synced evaluators described him as the best pure pocket passer in the 2025 class. CBS Sports Draft Profile called him surgical from a clean pocket. There were legitimate concerns, acknowledged in every evaluation. He held the ball too long, took too many sacks, and showed a tendency to bail from clean pockets due to the pressure-heavy environment Colorado put him in. Those were real. They were also the concerns of the second-round pick, not a player who falls out of the top 140. A NFC coordinator told NFL Network before the draft, his college tape looked like Caleb Williams without the elite physical arm talent. That quote is the most honest thing said about Sanders during the entire pre-draft process, because it explains the ceiling concern without the character frame. Caleb Williams was the first overall pick in the 2024 draft. A player whose tape resembles a first overall pick's tape minus the elite arm does not fall to pick 144, not based on football. The sandbagging reports deserve particular examination because they have been used to pin the slide on Sanders himself. The framing is, he did this to himself. He didn't take interviews seriously. Teams lost interest, and the market collapsed. There are two problems with that framing. First, the sandbagging reports came after the draft, as explanation, not before it as warning. If teams had genuinely decided Sanders was undraftable in the early rounds because of poor interview performance, you would expect that consensus to have been visible in the pre-draft trade market, in the conversations between scouts, in the big board adjustments. None of that happened. The big board stayed consistent. Daniel Jeremiah had him at 20th on draft eve. The slide happened in real time during the draft itself, as pick after pick was made, and Sanders was not selected. Albert Breer of Sports Illustrated reported that Sanders handled the process like he was a top 5 lock and declined meetings with teams he assumed would not select him early. That is a different charge than tanking interviews. That is a player who miscalculated his leverage, not a player who poisoned his own well. Second, and more revealing, the teams that passed on Sanders in the second and third rounds were not teams that had bad interviews with him. Many of them were teams he had met with, or teams that had his evaluations from other organizations. By day 2 of the draft, when the New Orleans Saints took Tyler Shaw 40th overall and the Seattle Seahawks took Jalen Milroe 92nd, the question was no longer whether any team wanted Sanders. It was whether any team was willing to be the first to take him and absorb the institutional cost of doing so. That cost had a specific shape. Drafting Shedeur Sanders meant drafting into the Deion Sanders orbit. It meant accepting that one of the most publicly opinionated and media-present figures in football would have a direct line to their franchise quarterback. Teams had watched Deion coach his son at Jackson State and then at Colorado, and while the results on the field were often impressive, the team's relationship with public narrative was unlike anything in college football. The Sanders brand was loud, intentional, and impossible to separate from the football. A lot of people just didn't want to deal with Deion Sanders and what that might be down the road, said one analyst on CBS Sports Radio. NFL scouting veteran Ray Fittipaldo confirmed the Steelers, who had a genuine need at quarterback, did not have Sanders graded inside their first 5 rounds. The Steelers, a team that desperately needed a quarterback, that had used Mason Rudolph as a starter, that passed on Sanders even in the 4th and 5th rounds when he was available at prices that required no commitment, no guarantee, no meaningful risk. They selected Will Howard in the 6th round instead. That decision is the clearest evidence of what was actually happening. Passing on a quarterback prospect the evaluation community rated in the top 35 players in the draft, in the 5th round, with no cost attached, is not a football decision. It is an institutional one. Now here is what the institution got for it. The NFL changed its draft rules before the 2026 draft, limiting access to prospects' personal contact information to one person per franchise, a direct response to the Jax Ulbrich prank call. The league issued $350,000 in fines related to that incident. One of the most widely covered stories of the 2026 draft, held in Pittsburgh 12 months later, was still the ghost of Shedeur Sanders' 2025 slide. His fall, as one reporter wrote at the time, hovered over the 2026 draft. Every player who walked into the 2026 combine had watched what happened to the most prominent prospect in the previous cycle. No one needed to issue a memo. The message had already been sent. Shedeur Sanders, for his part, made his NFL debut in Week 11 of the 2025 season against the Baltimore Ravens, entering in the second half after fellow rookie Dillon Gabriel, the man drafted 50 picks ahead of him by the same team, was evaluated for a concussion. In that first appearance, Sanders completed 4 of 16 passes for 47 yards, with 1 interception, in a 23-16 Cleveland loss. He was then named the starter for the following week, and in his first start, a Week 12 matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders, he completed 11 of 20 passes for 209 yards with a touchdown and an interception in a 24-10 Browns win. 2 weeks later, in Week 14 against the Tennessee Titans, he threw for 364 yards and 3 touchdowns, while also rushing for a score, becoming the first Browns player in franchise history to combine 300-plus passing yards, 3 touchdown throws, and a rushing touchdown in the same game. He finished the season with 1,400 passing yards, 7 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions across 8 games, a 7-to-10 ratio that reflects exactly what you would expect from a quarterback thrown into a broken roster without first-team practice reps for the first 9 weeks of his rookie year. He made the Pro Bowl as a replacement. He is now competing for the starting job in 2026 against Deshaun Watson, who has played 73 regular season games in his NFL career and is returning from an Achilles injury that kept him out for most of 2025. And Dillon Gabriel, the rookie taken in the 3rd round ahead of him. Browns ownership is reportedly pushing for Watson to start. The coach, Todd Monken, is staying quiet publicly. Sanders posted a cryptic message on Instagram in May 2026 about focusing on God rather than other people's opinions. A year into his NFL career, the man the league made an example of is still inside the institution that made an example of him, competing for a job against a player on a $230 million contract who hasn't been fully healthy in years, in a city he did not choose, behind a rookie who was drafted by the same franchise 50 picks earlier. Every variable of his NFL existence was shaped by the draft position the league assigned him. That is the mechanism. The position number did not reflect the talent evaluation. It reflected a power calculation. And once a player's position number is set, everything downstream, the contract, the reps, the coach's trust, the front office's patience, follows from it. This is what the NFL actually sold the 2025 draft audience. It sold them a meritocracy, a process in which the most talented players go to the teams that need them most, evaluated by objective criteria and placed by a market that rewards production. What it ran instead was a compliance exam. The teams that passed on Shedeur Sanders were not deciding whether he could play quarterback. They had already decided he could. They were deciding whether the benefit of his production was worth the cost of his independence, and the cost of signaling to the rest of the player pool that that kind of independence had a price. By the time the Browns traded up 22 spots with the Seattle Seahawks, giving up picks 166 and 192 to grab pick 144, General Manager Andrew Berry was essentially making a secondary market acquisition, picking up a discounted asset because the primary market had collectively decided not to price it fairly. Berry said afterward that Sanders offered too much value to pass up at that point. He was right. The value was there from the beginning. The pick number was never about the value. The hidden cost of the 2025 draft's most celebrated meritocracy story is carried by every college player who watched it. The NIL era gave college players money, leverage, and alternatives for the first time. The Shedeur Sanders draft is the clearest evidence of what the NFL does with players who arrive already knowing they have options. The league's mechanisms, the anonymous leaks, the coordinated interview narratives, the inexplicable cross-franchise consensus did not bend those options out of existence. They priced them. The cost of entering the NFL with leverage, with a father who speaks publicly, with watches and deals and a posture of someone who does not need rescuing, turned out to be roughly 110 draft positions. The players in the 2026 draft class absorbed that lesson before they ever set foot in Indianapolis for their combine. Reports ahead of the 2026 draft noted the absence of any polarizing figure, any player who carried himself the way Sanders did, any family orbit that made front offices uncomfortable. That is not a coincidence. It is the outcome the 2025 draft was designed to produce. The message moved through agents and position coaches and the informal networks that connect college programs to NFL organizations long before the Pittsburgh draft began. You can have NIL money. You can have a public profile. The draft will still find a number for you. And if you arrive with the wrong posture, that number will teach you something about who is actually in charge of this process. One analyst at the 2026 draft said directly that Sanders had shown every prospect in the country what happens when you don't handle yourself the right way. The phrase the right way did what it always does in NFL coverage. It laundered an institutional preference into a character judgment, without ever having to say what the preference actually was. Whether that pricing holds is the one thing this evidence cannot yet answer. Shedeur Sanders is still playing. The data on what he actually is as an NFL quarterback is 8 games old, in a chaotic situation, on a team that went 5-12. If he develops into a franchise quarterback, the 2025 draft becomes the most expensive mistake of institutional overcorrection in the history of the position. If he doesn't, 31 front offices will spend the next decade telling themselves the football reasons were real all along. Watch what Cleveland does with the starting job this summer. Not because it tells you whether Shedeur Sanders can play, but because it tells you whether the institution that made an example of him intends to give him a fair chance to prove the example wrong.